Alright, we are back with a new video, and today, now that Season 5 of the Circle is wrapped up, I want to do a player ranking where I ranked all the players in the game based on the games that they played during the season. And this was an interesting list to put together, but I'm going to do my best. And as a quick note, I will be counting Brett and Xanthi separately for this list, as opposed to calling them one player and Jennifer. So with that, there are 12 players to look at, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, and really you could debate these bottom two, however I did decide to go with the first boot, and here we have Brian, also known as Brittany, and I feel like Brian is someone who definitely has a decent mind for social strategy games, as we saw him immediately suspect Bruno being a catfish, and I feel like he's someone who probably could have done better on a different show. However, with him playing a catfish, I feel like he really restricted himself and really held back with opening up, probably fearing that if he revealed too much, that he would give off suspicions of being a catfish, given he was playing as someone radically different than himself, like him playing as his daughter. But I feel like through doing that, he really limited his bonds within the house to where he was never really that highly rated. He was obviously sixth place in the first rating, and he was last place in the second rating. And really, by the time he gets sent out, he doesn't really have anyone in his corner, where even Chaz, who had been trying to get him to open up, doesn't really back him, and he's obviously bought because of that. So I feel like Brian is someone who probably isn't the worst player in the world, but I feel like on this season with him choosing to play as a catfish, he really did not set himself up well, which is why he is here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and again, you can debate this person being below Brian, and believe me, there are plenty of holes in this person's game. However, I feel like this person was at least trying to play the game more, and I feel like there's more weird circumstances that caused their game to blow up. But here we have Shooby, also known as Sasha. And again, say what you will about Shooby, believe me, there are plenty of holes in this game where you can clearly tell that he was not comfortable playing as a catfish, and yet he tried to get around it by playing very strategically, by him basically going into everyone he was talking to and building alliances with them without really too much setup. Now, interestingly, I actually rewatched some parts of season 1, and he actually did this to a degree early on in season 1 as well. However, here it was much more blatant, and you could clearly tell that people were not on board with that, as he never really found his footing in the house. He had a similar problem to Brian, where because he didn't want to reveal too much information for fearing that he would contradict himself or get caught up in lies, that he didn't want to present that possibility. But in doing so, it made it harder for people to connect with him, and at the same time, actually make people suspect that he could be a catfish. And I also think that explains why people were not as willing to work with him strategically, even though he was coming up to them with alliances. Now, I do think Shooby gets a bit unlucky with the twist during the first round, where he has to choose between voting out Bruno and Jennifer after he had told them that he was super close to them and that he had built an alliance with them. And while I think he makes the correct decision in voting out Bruno over Jennifer, I think he handles it in a less than ideal way, to where Bruno is mad at him and she ends up berating him in her farewell message, to where people are again more suspicious of Shooby moving forward. After that, we do see him try to build that newbies alliance that would gang up against the original players, which I don't think is the worst move in the world, especially considering that Chaz and Raven were running the game, and that by teaming up the newbies that they could take out those power players. But again, the fact that no one really buys into it, despite it potentially working out for them, is not ideal either. And really, by the time of the next ratings, Shooby is essentially the next target, doesn't really have much room to maneuver, and sure enough, he is blocked at the first opportunity. So it is a pretty bumpy game, and considering that he makes more mistakes along the way compared to Brian, there is a debate for him being below Brian. However, the main reason I don't is I feel like Shooby was at least trying to play the game more, and while I don't think he makes the worst strategic decisions in the world, I also think his social play is less than ideal, especially with him trying to play as a catfish, to where he is largely ineffective. But it's through those things that leave him here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we sort of have a similar player, but here we have Billie Jean, also known as Bruno. And Billie Jean is again similar to Brian and Shooby, where she came in trying to play as a catfish, only for it to not work. And I feel like Billie Jean is someone who definitely could have done better if she had played as herself, where the main reason she plays as a man is to see whether men have it easier, which is something. But because she plays as a catfish and someone who is pretty different from her, it causes her to not really open up as much, and in turn, not really build as many social bonds. And the main reason I do have Billie Jean above Brian and Shooby is I feel like she had a bit more success in building inroads. She was able to build a connection with Chaz and was even able to open up to Chaz, which makes Chaz want to work with her moving forward. However, even then, it's not really enough to keep her at the bottom, where despite doing all right in the first rating, getting third place, she's already second to the last on the second rating, and then she puts herself in direct danger when she picks Shooby over Tasia in the challenge, which is a bit of a knock where, yes, you do see her build that alliance with Shooby. However, Tasia was someone who garnered support from most of the house, and the fact that Billie Jean didn't recognize that most of the house was backing Tasia over Shooby is a knock, and it is something that directly costs her game, where it makes sense for Shooby to take her out over Jennifer, someone who had connections with Tom and someone that could have built Shooby better connections moving forward. So on the whole, I'm not super impressed by Billie Jean's game, but I feel like they have a bit more merit to their game compared to the people we already talked about, which is why she is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and guess what? We have another catfish, and we actually have the first finalist on the board, but here we have Tasia, also known as Tamira, and I think Tasia played a pretty bad game, if you ask me. Now, again, she does get all the way to the finale. Now, granted, she was a late entry, so take that as you will. And she does have some merit to her. Like, she does win that initial challenge against Shooby, where most of the house does end up backing her, so there's that. And she also builds a decent bond with people like Raven and with Marvin, for instance, to where Marvin even has a bit of a flirtmance with her. But outside that, she doesn't really connect super well with a lot of the house, to where she is 6th place out of 8 in the first rating that she participates in, which isn't great. And then she decides to tell Raven about with the Marvin situation, like thinking that'll gain her some favor, which does successfully blow up Marvin's game to where Marvin becomes an outcast thereafter. However, it doesn't really benefit Tasia's game either, as again, Marvin was someone who was close to her, and Tasia doesn't really do much beyond revealing this information and letting it fester in the house, as she ends up in second to last in the very next rating behind Marvin. And while she is staying over Marvin, it's not really something that benefits Tasia's game. And really, from that point on, she does try to play more strategically. She does recognize that Jennifer and Chaz are on top, and she decides to tank them in the ratings. However, it's not really enough to keep Chaz from becoming influencer, and even then, she herself does not do particularly well in the ratings. And by the end of it, she essentially has no shot of winning, where it really is amazing that Chaz does not end up blocking her, despite her trying to tank him in the ratings. And even by the end of it, despite her being less of a threat, she is still in 4th place in the final rating, which is pretty bad, all things considered. So really, there isn't really too much to praise about Tasia's game. However, there are a bit more merits to Tasia's game compared to everyone we already talked about, which is why she's here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and this is another debatable one, as you could see this person being below Tasia. However, I feel like this person was at least in a better position, at least at one point, compared to Tasia. But here we have Marvin, and Marvin's an interesting case as well, as I do think he was in a alright position early on. He did align pretty closely with Chaz and Raven. He also had a very close relationship to Raven. And while it didn't translate to him being super high in the ratings, where he was 4th place in each of the 2 ratings, he did seem well liked enough within the house to where people want to keep him around. Now, granted, he does get into some trouble when Tom starts suspecting him being a catfish, and Tom eventually ends up targeting him as well, which isn't great. But obviously, the big thing is when Tasia enters the game and he has a bit of a showmance with her. Now, the show tries to present this as this really immoral thing, which, to be fair, probably is in the real world. But within a game like this, like, it actually isn't the worst thing in the world, where he could have turned this into having like another alliance with Tasia, and through that he could have further solidified his position. But then Tasia decides to spill the beans to Raven, which ultimately makes Marvin a pariah moving forward. And really, from that point on, he essentially has no shot, where he is essentially at the bottom of the ratings in the round that Shooby goes home, and then he is eventually taken out himself. So obviously a really bad game. And while I personally don't see this as big of a transgression compared to the way people in the game saw it, Marvin should have recognized that Raven would be upset by something like this and should have held back a bit more and not made it so much about romance. So I do think that's another knock against him. So it's not a great game, but there are two things that have Marvin, at least about Tasia for me. One was that there was at least a point where he was in a better position compared to Tasia, where he was in that power position early on in the majority alliance. And plus, I think had he not made it solely about romance, that he could have actually used Tasia as an ally. And through that, I could see Marvin using that to make a deeper run. So I do think Marvin at least had a bit more upside and he had a bit more outs compared to the situation. But at the end of the day, he still technically blew up his own game. So because of that, he is here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7. And I was actually somewhat impressed by this person's game. However, at the end of the day, I feel like they don't have as high of highs compared to the people we'll be talking about. But here we have Oliver, and I think Oliver played an alright game, all things considered. He did build a very good bond with Chaz and Raven, who at that point were controlling the game. And I feel like he was largely well liked in the house to where people really wanted to take him further in the game. He does get 4th place in the rating that he is a part of. And really, he probably should have gotten towards the end of the game. Now, I do think at the end of the day, it is a knock that Chaz ends up blocking him, despite the fact that Oliver made it very clear to Chaz that he would have rated him highly in the future compared to someone like Tasia. So I do think that's a pretty big knock to Oliver's game. And plus, at the end of the day, he was such a late entry. There isn't too much to go off of. But considering the time that he was in the game, he did do some good work. So because of that, I do have him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have another later entry into the game. And while this person made more mistakes compared to Oliver, I feel like this person, again, has a bit more upside. But here we have Tom. And Tom was another person that I think played an alright game for the most part. Now there are some bumpy roads, like I think early on he doesn't build the best connection with certain people, which does make people a bit suspect of him, like they don't like how he jokes all the time. Although he does rectify that by eventually opening up during the challenge, that builds some good favor with people. I also think he does a good job at playing the game strategically, where he builds that alliance with Jennifer, where they agree to get information. And for the most part, I feel like it's pretty effective in that regard. And I do give him some credit for saving Jennifer during the round where Jennifer and Bruno were on the block after the follower competition. I do think he does an effective job of talking to Shooby and convincing him that it's better to keep Jennifer in the game compared to Bruno, which obviously ends up going through. And he does eventually become influencer at the first round that he's eligible to. Now, within that, I do think he makes a bit of a questionable decision by blocking Shooby, where yes, Shooby was a pretty big target by that point, but Shooby was also someone that was more willing to work with Tom moving forward compared to Chaz. So I feel like by cutting Shooby there, I feel like that limits Tom's options moving forward. He also gets on to Marvin, which does eventually culminate in Marvin being taken out. And he does get eventually caught up in the newbie alliance controversy where Jennifer is telling these lies about Tasia forming the newbie alliance and then all the original players came mad at them. He does get caught up in that to where essentially Jennifer and Tom are in a bad spot at that point. And we do see by the end of it that Jennifer ends up cutting Tom by tanking him in the ratings in the round in which the lowest rated player is automatically eliminated. So I do think Tom lacked a killer instinct there by not thinking strategically, while Jennifer was all too willing to tank him in the ratings as a self-preservation move. So at the end of the day, I think Tom definitely has some holes within his game, but I feel compared to the people we already talked about, I feel like he has higher highs in his game. So because of that, I do have him here at number 6. Now I'm moving on to number 5, and we're finally moving on to one of the halves of Jennifer, and here we have Xanthi. And Xanthi is an interesting figure because I feel like during that initial round where she was playing as herself, I think she makes more mistakes than Brett that cause her to be blocked, where she decides to tell everyone going in that she's going to be this preschool teacher, like when in fact she's actually a model. However, I feel like she does things during that first round that really undercut that perception, where she decides to post pretty pictures that make people really question whether she is a preschool teacher and in turn question her in general. She also makes some questionable decisions during that initial game, where she is one of the only people to say that she would rather be a leader than a team player, which isn't great. And she also is the only one to say that she would rather be successful than happy, which, again, considering that she is supposed to be a preschool teacher, really undercuts that perception to a lot of people, considering preschool teachers aren't exactly the most well paid people in the world. I guess a minor pro you could say that she has over Brett is the fact that Brett had more people willing to block him during the first round, whereas Xanthi only had Chaz willing to block her, which obviously says something about her game. However, even then, Chaz was an influencer, and Chaz was someone that she herself had rated second. So the fact that Chaz was not reciprocating her feelings about him, and Chaz was someone who would have been an influencer anyway, I feel like Xanthi is someone who probably would have been a first boot even if it had been a normal round. So really, I think on the whole, Xanthi actually played the first round worse compared to Brett, which is part of the reason why I have her below Brett on the list. However, even after they come into the game as Jennifer, I do think she plays better from that point on. She gets to highlight her game a bit more. However, even then, I think Brett is more out in front as a strategic force within that duo. And obviously, by the end, well, they end up blowing up their game. And obviously, by the end, Jennifer has no shot of winning. So I do think Jennifer is, on the whole, a very interesting player, but I feel like within that, Xanthi is probably the worst player within that duo when assessing their entire game. So because of that, I do have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the other half of Jennifer, but here we have Brett. And I will say that as a Big Brother fan, it was very interesting seeing Brett coming back to play on this season, especially with Marvin, and I did enjoy that conversation they had during that first round. And part of the reason why I have Brett above Xanthi is, one, I do think his first round, he makes fewer mistakes compared to Xanthi, where yes, there are more people willing to block him, where Bruno, where Raven, and Sam are all willing to block him. However, I feel like a lot of that is simply because Brett didn't click well right out the bat with a lot of these people, which is a flaw. Like, he should have been able to fit in with this group of people better. However, compared to Xanthi, who literally did things to undercut her image when she was trying to tell this lie and didn't really do things to back up that lie, I feel like Xanthi made more mistakes compared to Brett. Whereas I feel like if Brett had stayed in the game, I feel like Brett could have definitely gotten a bit more runway. But obviously, his game really takes off after they enter the game as Jennifer. And again, Jennifer is able to do relatively well within the game. That does allow them to get all the way to the end of the game. And there are some flashes there. Like, they do build that alliance with Tom. That's something. They get third place in the first ratings that they're eligible for, which is pretty good there. However, they do have a bit of a misstep with voting for Shooby in that follower contest. It does make them vulnerable. And considering that Shooby built the alliance with Bruno before building an alliance with Jennifer, that did put them in a pretty precarious spot. And similar to what I said with Bruno, the fact that they thought that Shooby was going to get more votes than Tasia really is a big knock there. It almost cost them the game. However, they had Tom on their side, so they were able to get out of that situation. However, by the end of it, they do get caught in a lie where they do try to claim that Tasia was the one to create this newbie alliance. And after they gets back and after they get called out for it, I don't think they handle it well at all, to where by that point on, Jennifer is essentially on the outs. And by the end of it, they get last place in the final rating. So it is a bit of a bumpy game, sort of similar to what I feel with Nick from season 3. Although even then, I don't think Nick made nearly as many mistakes compared to Jennifer. However, I do think Brett still played an impressive game on the season as Jennifer. And even in the first round where he was himself, he didn't make as many mistakes. So because of that, I do have him above Xanthi at number 4. Now I'm moving on to number 3, and I really thought about this, as I feel like these next two players have similar issues in my opinion, where I feel like neither of them were playing the game too strategically, and I feel like through that, it makes it hard for me to prop up their games too much. However, one of these players was in a much better position in terms of the ratings throughout the entire game before the final ratings compared to this other person. So I decided to base it off that, although I feel like these two are relatively close. But at number 3, I did decide to go with Sam, the winner of the season. And Sam is a tough player to assess because if we're looking at their consistency across the ratings, they are all over the place, where she is last in the first ratings, even getting below Xanthi in those first ratings, which is not great at all. However, she does jump up to third place during the second ratings. She does vote correctly in voting for Tasia over Shooby. She then drops down to fifth place in the next ratings, which isn't great, but then she jumps back up to second place during the round that Marvin goes home. And we assume that she did relatively well in the penultimate ratings, even though she didn't become super influencer. And then she does win the game, largely due to people like Tasia and to a degree Jennifer taking the bigger threats in Chaz and Raven in the final ratings. So if we're looking at her game, it is sort of up and down based on the actual ratings. However, she does build very good bonds with a lot of the players. I mean, she is in the majority for so much of the game. She built bonds well with Tasia for a lot of it. She bonds well with Raven. And most importantly, she becomes Chaz's number one. She becomes Chaz's closest ally throughout the entire game. And through that, she is able to stay in the majority for pretty much the entire game. So I feel like through that, there is a lot of merit to her game. However, it's simply due to the lack of consistency with her across the ratings that doesn't make me feel super highly with her. And especially with the fact that she was one of these people talking about voting genuinely throughout the game. She didn't seem to be playing the game as hard as so many other people. I can't really have her too much higher than number three. However, at the end of the day, I still find there to be quite a bit of merit with her game. So because of that, she is here at number three. Now we're moving on to number two, and we have a similar player, although this player was in power for a lot more of the game compared to Sam. But here we have Raven. And again, Raven was very well liked within the house to where she was influencer in almost every round of the game, with the only rounds where she wasn't the influencer being the round where Shooby goes home in the penultimate rating where obviously Chaz is a super influencer. Every other time she is either first or second in the ratings, which I think really goes to show how well liked she was within the house. But at the same time, I don't think she handles a lot of her power too wisely, or at least not in a strategic manner. I feel like she's one of these people who, despite being well liked and despite her getting power because she's well liked, doesn't really see the game as overly strategic. And through that, she is someone who largely propels people deeper into the game simply based on her relationship to them, while cutting people that burn her along the way. Where during the first round, she wants to keep Brittany around, doesn't get her way there, which isn't great, but again, she was well liked enough to where people want to keep her anyway. But again, then we get to the Marvin stuff, which again, I understand where she's coming from, where it's obvious she sees it as a showman's, and that she sees Marvin flirting with Tasia to be on the same level as someone who cheats on her in real life rather than seeing it as a game move, which I don't think is great. Now, to be fair, Marvin also genuinely was flirting with Tasia during a lot of it. But the fact that she was targeting Marvin for so much of it, despite the fact that Marvin really went out of his way to apologize to her and was even willing to go as far as to rate her highly in future ratings, is a bit of a misstep strategically. Although at the same time, I do see where she is coming from. And I do think she struggles a bit with threat management as well, to where by the end, she is such a blatant threat to where people aren't as willing to rate her super highly. Now, granted, she still gets third place in the final ranking, which I do think is largely due to people like Tasia and Jennifer being around for people to tank in the ratings. But I still feel like based on her threat level, she was unlikely to actually win the game. And plus, with her not being as strategic as certain other players, I can't really have her at the number one spot, but I still think she played a relatively impressive game and still dominated a decent portion of the game. So because of that, I do have her here at number two. And now at number one, the player I believe played the best game on the Circle Season 5 is Chaz, the runner-up of the season. And I feel like Chaz and Raven are pretty similar in that they're both really well liked throughout the season to where they were consistently rated high in the rankings. And actually Chaz even more so to where literally the only round where he is not an influencer is the Marvin round. And even then he still got third place in the ratings. So he has a better track record within the ratings compared to Raven. He obviously still gets second place in the final ratings, despite the fact that people like Jennifer and Tasia recognized him as the big threat that he was, which I really think goes to show how great he was at building relationships throughout the game. And plus, while I wouldn't say Chaz is overly strategic in the grand scheme of things, I think Chaz did more things within the game that benefited his positioning. Like, he does get his way more often than not during the game when he is influencer over Raven. Like, during that first round, like, he wants to say Bruno, and sure enough, he gets his way. He blocks Brittany over Bruno, which is something that Raven did not want to happen. He's also able to block Shooby over Marvin. Even after the point where Marvin was becoming a bigger target, he's able to get his way there, taking away a number from Jennifer and Tom, which I think is pretty good. And despite people like Jennifer and Tasia recognizing him as a big threat and trying to undercut him, his relationships with the rest of the house are very strong to the point where they don't matter as much in the ratings. To where even after Tasia tries tanking him in the ratings, he still gets third place in the Marvin round. And then obviously in the penultimate round, he becomes a super influencer. And obviously he has the sole vote to evict. Although I do think at that point he makes a pretty questionable decision in blocking Oliver over Tasia or Jennifer, where I understand that he may not have recognized that Tasia was tanking him in the ratings. However, Oliver was someone he had a much better relationship with in the house compared to Tasia, to the point where Oliver was flirting with him and made it pretty clear that he would have rated him highly moving forward. So I think by Chaz cutting Oliver here, he actually harms his chances of winning the game. And considering that he left both Tasia and Jennifer in the game over Oliver, I think that is a big factor in why their votes are enough to deny him the win at the very end. So I think he does make a bit of a mistake at the very end of the game that I would debate would have cost him the game. But at the end of the day, I still think he played by far the best game. He dominated so much of the game. He had very strong relationships. I feel like he was a bit more strategically minded compared to Raven, and certainly made more moves that benefited his position throughout the game. And despite all that, he came closer to winning the game compared to Raven. So I feel like through all those things, Chaz clearly played the best game on the season, and because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now I am planning to at least make one more circle video before my coverage wraps up, so stay tuned for that. I'm also making other coverage of other reality shows, particularly Australian Survivors, that's coming up, so stay tuned for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. There's a lot of stuff coming in the following weeks. But for now, that's the video. See ya.